ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another IBM Aviation video here on my channel. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at the most versatile, iconic, robust and efficient aircraft in the history of aviation. Some people call it immortal because it was not only used effectively during the 1930s and World War II, but is still flown today in modern civil and military aviation. So if you haven't guessed yet, then I'll of course give you the answer. We are going to talk about the Douglas DC-3, DC standing for Douglas Commercial, how it developed, and of course its specifications, almost everything you have to know about this amazing aircraft. And of course I'll try to articulate everything as good as possible according to my own research. So yeah, let's go to the video. Now, without further ado, let's begin. So in the 1920s, when passenger travel and civil aviation started to develop immensely, and of course with the advent of the amazing Boeing 247 aircraft, many airlines were in dire need of a fast aircraft that was at the same time, aerodynamically efficient, but also fast to travel and, transport passengers. And one of these airlines was Transcontinental Western Airlines. Of course, back then people had aircrafts that could fly efficiently, but they were still slow and pretty heavy. For example, the Ford Trimotor. Of course, it was rigid and robust, but it was still too heavy and slow to transport passengers over long distances efficiently. So it is worthy to note that everything began with Transcontinental Western Airlines, or TWA's, request to Donald Douglas to actually produce an aircraft that could compete with the new Boeing 247 of the United Airlines. The actual reason for it is that Boeing didn't want to cooperate with other companies before they could actually finish their delivery of 60 aircraft to United Airlines, and so they didn't want to sell any aircraft to Transcontinental Western Airlines yet. So that is the reason why TWA wanted to request these new aircraft that could actually compete with the Boeing 247 from Donald Douglas, the founder of Douglas Aircraft Company. So even though Douglas actually specified on military aircraft before that very moment, they still agreed to build the first DC-1 for TWA in 1933. And this very process actually continued with the advent of DC-2 in 1934, and that is the moment that I actually call the pre-design phase of the DC-3. And no doubt the DC-2 was a success, but it was far not the end of the process. In fact, it was only the beginning. Just a single call from Cyrus Rowlett Smith, American Airlines CEO, changed the history of aviation. The key point is that American Airlines CEO actually requested from Donald Douglas to build an aircraft that could actually replace the DC-2 and be a sleeper aircraft at the same time. That is to say, it should include sleeping berths on board. He also wanted to replace American Airlines Curtiss T-32 Condor II aircrafts and, build something else, and that is why he requested it from Donald Douglas. However, the issue was not quite easy because Donald Douglas was himself quite reluctant to actually begin the process. But as soon as he heard that Cyrus Rowlett Smith is ready to purchase 20 aircrafts, new aircrafts, he of course commenced the process. And that is quite understandable because many aircraft companies or airlines lost a lot of money during that time, since civil aviation was not that developed as it is today nowadays. Air travel specifically. Many people used to travel, by aircraft during the day and still use trains overnight. However, going back to the design phase, the DC-3 was actually engineered by Arthur A. Raymond, who also contributed to all the DC aircraft beginning from DC-1 to DC-8. And so the aircraft was actually designed by him and his team over a period of 2 years. So as I already mentioned, American Airlines CEO actually requested from Douglas to build a DST, or basically Douglas Sleeper Transport, or basically sleeper aircraft. That is to say, sleeping berths were included on board, and most of the times they were 2 stories, actually beds, where people could sleep during the flight. And if you notice on some photographs of the DST aircrafts, which were actually the first DC-3 variants of the aircraft, they included 2 windows, one which was a little bit smaller on the top part of the fuselage, and the second one which was of course a standard window. That is for the very reason so that passengers could actually look outside if they wished, both on the second story of the bed and on the first story, of course. The main reason for building the DC-3 was also because DC-2 was not as wide as the DC-3 was and not as long as it was. So just imagine that the DC-3 was 19.7 meters approximately, while the DC-2 was around 18.5. It is still an improvement, and if you look at the wingspan, the DC-3's wingspan improved also immensely by having it on 29 meters, while the DC-2 had only 25. But the main reason was also the width of the fuselage. The DC-2 had only 1.7 meters width, while the DC-3 had actually 2.3, which is a very good improvement to include the sleeping berths and to transport passengers more comfortably. Moreover, if you look at later versions of the DC-3, they actually had around 21 to 32 seats, which is still an improvement in comparison with the DC-2, which had actually around 14 to 16 seats in the cabin. So the first flight of the DC-3 was actually made on 17th of December 1935, while the first passenger service was on the 26th of June 1936 by American Airlines as the first operator of the aircraft. The DC-3 had 3-cycle landing gear, as is probably seen on pictures, and it is often even called the conventional landing gear. So the main landing gear of the DC-3 was actually retractable, while the tail wheel was not. So the DC-3 was initially powered by 2 radial piston engines, the Wright R1820, but later variants also include engines such as Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp. Could fly at a top speed of 333 km per hour or 207 miles per hour, but some versions or variants such as the DC-3 glider could even fly much faster, and we'll get back to it later in this video. Last but not least, it had a range of 1,500 miles or approximately 2,400 kilometers. The DC-3 could fly from New York to Los Angeles only in 18 hours with 3 stops, whereas people before actually used to fly the aircraft during the day and then travel by train during the night, which is a completely new experience for the passengers, but also an improvement in the aviation industry. In 1939, almost 90% of all passenger flights were made on the DC-3. So now that we understand what the DC-3 actually was and how everything began, we have to understand why it was so special during that time. Now, the first thing we have to understand is that the DC-3 was actually all-metal construction, mostly made of alkyd aluminum on its skin and other structural components. Now, this aluminum is actually known for its corrosion resistance. Now, this aluminum coating was actually rolled onto the surface, and it could at the same time, of course, be corrosion resistant, but also maintain the strength of the core alloy, which is a great improvement, and it is actually very efficient. So the so-called 2024 aluminum was also used and mixed with copper. Or more precisely, it actually comprised mostly of copper as the primary alloying element. And it was generally effective for the strength-to-weight ratio, which is basically a ratio between the weight or the relation with the weight of the aircraft to the strength of the aircraft. Simply having a lightweight while maintaining the strength is the most effective choice. Moreover, high strength still was used for components such as the landing gear, fasteners, and engine mounts. Once again for the reason of durability during the flight and operation. Magnesium alloys were actually used for components such as wheel hubs, aircraft brackets and fittings. And so the structure was generally a semi-monocoque structure with spar strips and stringers sharing the load and bearings and even the stresses during the flight equally, which is very efficient, since the responsibilities are not only spread to the external skin but also to the internal structure of the aircraft. So even if one of the, let's say, external skin is by any means harmed or something, or probably destructed, then the internal skin or internal components will still try to maintain the stability of the structure. Now, for those who didn't know, spars are these latitudinal components used in the structure of the wing generally, but also for the aircraft, and ribs are those components that are actually longitudinally used for the aircraft structure. And I hope that this picture can actually illustrate this components much better. Now, last but not least, we didn't mention the aerodynamic efficiency of Douglas DC-3, since it was a streamlined design with smooth fuselage and actually a rounded fuselage and tapered wings. It was very efficient aerodynamically to produce lifts and hence lift from the airstrips or actually the runways much quicker than other aircraft did before. The wing was also full cantilever, which actually means that it didn't have any bracing or struts to support it, or to support the structure, which is also aerodynamically efficient since it produced much less drag than it would do with struts and bracings otherwise. Even though sometimes the drag produced from these struts and bracings is insignificant compared to other components, such as the fuselage itself. So unfortunately, the civil aircraft production actually suspended in 1943, but this was far not the end. Even though they produced 607 aircrafts by that time, the production still continued in the military aviation, which we are going to talk about now. So one of the main reasons why the DC-3 was converted into a military version was because of its ability to land on rough and actually unpaved surfaces, which was of course very efficient during wartime, but also because its structure and design actually allowed for easy modifications. Moreover, the DC-3 had a high aspect ratio wing, which produced less induced drag and had a capacity or payload capacity of as much as 6,000 pounds or around 2,725 kilograms, which is pretty much compared to its rivals, such as the Boeing 247, which had around 5,000 pounds of payload capacity, and Lockheed L-10 Electra, which had only 1,500 pounds capacity. Now, this was in its turn effective in military aviation for the transportation of troops, cargo, but also for airborne command posts and reconnaissance, and nonetheless medical evacuation. Now, the military DC-3s were usually designated as C-57s or C-47s, sorry, and C-53s, usually even called Dakotas or Sky Troopers. The military version had actually 3 flight crew places, while the ordinary commercial aviation, or basically civil aviation version, only had 2 flight crew places. And of course, the military version had more powerful engines, and these were actually the Pratt & Whitney R1830 that we mentioned before, actually the twin Wasps. They were mostly used for the military versions of the DC-3. Now, other variants along with the military versions of this aircraft were actually the ones that were built under license in Soviet Union, for example, and the DC-3s there were actually called Lisunovs, or Lisunovs Li-2s. And they were also built in Japan under, of course, the Japanese designation of Showa or Nakajima L2D, but they were still the actual DC-3s, but copied in one way or another, of course. In other words, let's say they were based on the DC-3. Now, some people say that along with the military production of the DC-3s, of course, counting with the civil aviation aircraft production, there were actually 10,936 aircrafts produced, and some people even say that 16,000 DC-3s were produced in total. Now, an interesting story to hear about the military version of the DC-3 is that once an aircraft operated by the China's National Aviation Corporation was actually bombed, or to be more precise, its left wing was almost completely annihilated by war activities, and so it was later replaced with a wing of a DC-2 instead, though the damaged aircraft was a DC-3. So just imagine what happened next. Well, actually, the accident took place at Suifu Airfield in China, and what happened next is that they made a test flight on this aircraft, and what happened is that it pulled to the right. Now, this accident is something that one might actually expect in such occasions, because the imbalance caused by the asymmetry of 2 wings was due to, for example, difference in lift produced by the DC-3 wing and DC-2 wing, also uneven stress distribution on both wings, and probably also the offset of the center of gravity is one of the possible reasons for this pull to the right, among with other reasons that we're not going to mention right now in this video, but just cut it short. Nonetheless, it is important to note that this replacement with a DC-2 wing was not whimsical at all. Rather, it was urgent because of wartime, and they had to do something as quickly as possible in order to prevent consequences that probably were much worse. Now, apart from the military conversions, there were also engine conversions from piston engines to turboprop engines. on the DC-3. Now, one of these conversions took place in the 1950s. Turboprop engines such as Armstrong-Siddeley Mamba, or with the Armstrong-Siddeley Mamba turbines, RR Dart or Pratt & Whitney PT6 Alpha engines. Now, one of the most noteworthy conversions is probably the Basler BT67 turboprop conversion to Pratt & Whitney PT6 Alpha 67 Romeo turboprop engines. And this conversion is interesting not only because the engines were actually changed, but also because the fuselage was prolonged by 1000 millimeters and because the airframe was generally strengthened. Now, if you ask the question why some DC-3 aircrafts were actually converted to turboprop, it's a good question and I have an answer for that. So I think that the absolutely first reason is modernization. Since turboprop engines could allow the DC-3 to be more competitive and fly more efficiently in the modern aviation, where piston engines were quite outdated. Since piston engines became less reliable and required more maintenance since they became older than the turboprops. Moreover, the turboprop engines are more fuel efficient and produce less emissions. Turboprops could also produce more power and fly faster and cover longer distances than those piston engines that were on this aircraft before. And now eventually we are getting back to the glider version of the Douglas DC-3. And yes, you hear me correctly. The DC-3 not only had military and commercial or civil aviation aircrafts, but it also had gliders to fly without engines or any power plant whatsoever. The gliders were actually called Douglas XCG-17s or X-Ray Sierra Romeo or Golf 17s. It was an assault glider converted from the C-47 Skytrain variant, actually the military variant, during the World War II. Now, an interesting fact to note is that the Douglas XCG-17 actually had its engines removed, as well as some unnecessary parts for the unpowered version of the aircraft. These unnecessary parts were, for example, the wirings and bulkheads, and generally the place where engines were before in the powered version were actually replaced by special hemispheres actually to compensate for the weight of the engines. These were aerodynamically efficient for the streamline or for the airflow to flow smoothly over the surface. The nacelles with landing gear were, in other words, also kept on the aircraft. The positions of radio and nav equipment were also changed on this glider version, and this version could actually fit 40 fully armed troops on it. Just imagine how much it is actually for a glider aircraft without any engines to power it. It could fly at a top speed of 464 kilometers per hour or 290 miles per hour, which was actually much faster than the powered version of the DC-3, which had engines on it. More specifically, it was 26% faster than the previous, the powered version of the DC-3 aircraft, which is incredible and actually amazing. These are actually amazing parameters, in other words. Moreover, it was 90 miles per hour faster than any glider that came previously in the history of aviation. Some additional facts about this amazing aircraft is that its sailing altitude was around 23,200 feet. The low stalling speed of the DC-3 also was part of its success, especially for the glider version, since it was as little as 67 miles per hour or 107 kilometers per hour. Moreover, its sailing speed sailing altitude, was around 23,200 feet, and it could fly pretty much comfortably at an altitude of 10,000 feet, which was pretty good during that time, and it's still pretty okay nowadays in aviation. So even though I hold the stance that DC-3 is absolutely inimitable as an aircraft, it still was not left without replacements, because during the late 1940s or during the 1940s, many people started to questioning when a major improvement will actually be made to these aircraft, because it has been now over 20 years that it's been just, left without any major improvements, and many people questioned how much time it would take for DC-3 to wear out. A second issue was that Douglas, or basically during the pre-war period, a specific document was actually published by the government called Bulletin 7A. It was basically a document that stipulated specific characteristics and requirements for an aircraft or airline to be considered safe. And Douglas did pretty good on meeting them, but after the war, during the post-war period, when a new document was published called the FAR 4B, or basically transport category requirements, Douglas DC-3 did not do well in actually meeting and complying with these requirements, which was a major issue. So now Douglas engineers started to think what to do next in order to meet these requirements and to be considered safe and actually continue their flights with the DC-3. So a solution of creating a new aircraft or engineering something new that could be better or should be better than the DC-3 was not a good solution, since it would be too costly and DC-3 was already too good. So the only choice for them was to improve the aircraft itself without creating something new. So that is simply how the Super DC-3 was born, and it had so many major modifications and improvements in it. For example, the front cabin and the rear cabin were totally actually prolonged by 79 inches, approximately 2 meters. Engines were replaced with more powerful ones, actually the ones that were used in DC-4 that made its first flight on the 14th of February 1942, and these engines were actually the Wright R2000 twin wasp engines, more powerful of course. Some modifications to the landing gear were also made. For example, the wheel well doors were changed and were now completely enclosed when the gear was retracted, but also the tail wheel was now retractable, though not completely, but it was partly retractable during the flight, which is a major improvement as well, especially concerning the aerodynamic issues or drag issues actually during the flights. They also increase the vertical and horizontal stabilizers in area and span, which is once again aerodynamically efficient. And it is also noticeable, if you look at the aircraft itself, because you can see that the tail of the aircraft is actually a little bit rectangular. And this is due to this particular reason, but mostly because the fuselage was prolonged and because all of these modifications were made. Now, smaller outer wing panels were also added. Actually, swept a little bit rearwards by 4 degrees in order to accommodate the change in the center of gravity. Generally, the seat capacity was also increased to 38 seats. They also added new air stairs and the payload was increased as well. The top speed was now 250 miles per hour compared to the previous 207 miles per hour, which is still a good improvement actually. And now, since the Super DC-3 originated from the military version of the DC-3 called C-47 Skytrain, now many people, the US Air Force actually designated it as Yankee Charlie 47 Foxtrot, even though before it was called Yankee Charlie 129. Now, it might seem surprising, but even though the Air Force used this new Super DC-3 for testing purposes, it did not impress them as much as the Convair 131, so they decided to choose the Convair instead. So as can be seen, the actual or the initial response to the production or to the improvement of the DC-3 was not as positive as was probably expected by many of you viewers. But anyways, in October 1949, it was taken to a 10,000 miles journey in order to demonstrate the aircraft and how indefatigable it was, how useful and efficient it was during these long-haul flights. And you might wonder, what restrictions did the aircraft have? Well, this new improvement had only one restriction in relation to altitude and goods to be transported. So it had a sailing altitude of 25,000 feet, which is still much better than the classic DC-3 with a sailing altitude of 23,200 feet, but it had restrictions on bottled goods, fresh fruit, and so on these high altitudes because the cabin itself was not pressurized. Moreover, now Douglas decided to offer airlines to replace their original DC-3s with these new Super DC-3s, as many people started to say that a replacement for the DC-3 is just a new DC-3. However, it was probably not as lucrative as many people would think, because the fee for the replacement of the aircraft to Super DC-3 was actually $150,000 compared to the base price of the original DC-3 during its production, or during its first production, which was actually $60,000 to $80,000. In other words, the price of the new Super DC-3 was much higher than that in the pre-war period. That is to say, many airlines, especially the smaller ones, could not afford such an investment. However, it was far not the end, because Capital Airlines, who actually used 23 of the DC-3s, the classical ones, decided to actually pay this fee for 3 new Super DC-3 aircrafts. So the first introduction of the Capital Airlines DC-3 was actually during a flight from Washington to Atlanta in July 1950. And you know what? Capital Airlines were actually pleased with the Super DC-3, especially concerning the servicing of the aircraft on ground. As they say, it took around 45 minutes to service the aircraft on ground compared to the classical DC-3, which took around 1 hour and 16 minutes, which is a major improvement actually. However, there were also airlines that did not accept the Super DC-3 because of its passenger licensing problems, or basically licensing problems for passenger use in particular. So that is why, for example, Pilgrim Airlines never accepted the aircraft. And generally speaking, the Super DC-3 was mainly enticing for the military domain of the aviation rather than for the civil aviation. And many might think that at this point this aircraft actually faded out of from aviation actually. But as a matter of fact, it never happened because it is reported that 19 of these aircrafts were still flying in the United States in 1993. One more astonishing feature of the Douglas DC-3 is actually its fuel capacity, which was as much as 822 US gallons compared to its rivals such as Boeing 247 and Lockheed Delta and Electra. So the Boeing 247 had actually a fuel capacity of 273 US gallons. Of course, it varies depending on the variants and versions, but still, it was 273 US gallons as a standard, and then the Lockheed Delta and Electra with its fuel capacity of 194 US gallons, which once again proves the uniqueness and superiority of the DC-3 in aviation industry, not only during that time, but even nowadays, as an iconic aircraft still in use 89 years later. So last but not least, I also wanted to mention the coziness of the cockpit and how unique it is at the same time if we pay attention to the upholstery made of high quality leather on the walls of the cockpit but also on the seats. And this once again proves how much effort the designers and engineers actually exerted to make the aircraft as comfortable, cozy and effective for long hauls and generally for flights, not only for the passengers but also for the pilots to feel comfortable during their flights. Of course, the instruments in the cockpit were mostly analog, which was pretty common during that time. To conclude, we can actually see that the DC-3 was an aircraft that showed its significance not only in civil aviation, but also in the military industry and glider industry as well. Many users are still amazed by the ingenious design and engineering of this amazing aircraft, and it still continues to fly nowadays. It would be unjust to say that the DC-3 retired completely, since the spirit of this aircraft is left in aviation forever. Nowadays, people can take a look at this aircraft in museums such as National Air and Space Museum in USA, but also in Hong Kong Science Museum, in China, and many other museums in the world. Since this aircraft is not completely grounded even nowadays, you can probably get a chance to fly it someday as well, if you're lucky enough. Thanks for watching this episode, and I hope you enjoyed. If I missed something and you have additional information about this aircraft, please write it down in the comments and I'll be happy to read it and, of course, learn something new as well. See you next time. Bye bye.